All right. So welcome to Building Impossible, in quotes, applications with Drupal and VueJS. So, do we talk about ourselves in here?
No.
No?
First slide.
First slide? All right, yeah. I'm David Pascal-Delorier. I'm the CTO of Coldfront Labs, and I do a lot of work with Statistics Canada.
I'm ptsimard. I'm a developer at Statcan for the last many years, since 2007. So, yes.
All right.
Oh, no. Statistics Canada is Canada's statistical agency. It's pretty big. It's heavily invested in Drupal, and that we, at Statcan, we made the choice of using Drupal 6 or 7 years ago, and we developed our own distribution called the WetKit, and now WXT, which is the Drupal 8 version. So we maintain it. So yeah, Stats use a lot of data, offers a lot of data services. So this talk will be touching on that.
All right. So, to give an introduction to this case study of a Drupal application, the first thing that we need to talk about is one of the data services that Statcan offers called the Real-Time Remote Access System, or RTRA. So the motivation behind this system is that Statcan has large data holdings, as you can imagine, all kinds of data. Raw data can't be released to the public because there are privacy issues in it because of all the individually collected data points. But what Statcan would like to do, and what RTRA does, is it allows researchers to query the data while mitigating any of the privacy issues by automatically adjusting the precision of the results returned. So in all of Statcan's data, if they let you query it, one of the problems you're going to have is sort of like this Facebook's ad problem of where you can target an ad with so many things that you only get the data for one person, or you only target one person. If you're able to query Statcan's data and we're clever about it, you could target sort of just a small group of people and get information that's so fine-grained about one person that there would be privacy issues. RTRA sort of addresses this by providing a system that takes a look at the queries, looks at how many data points you're actually looking at, and then will adjust the precision so that you can't know. If you only return 10 people, then it will start removing zeros until you don't know much about it, until there's no privacy issue. So here's how the current RTRA process works. So the researchers write a program in a language called Sass. They upload it to Statcan. It is securely transferred to the secure network. The program is scanned, executed, and the system adjusts the result precision. Excuse me. Then it is securely the result files get sort of compressed and then securely transferred back, and then the researchers can download them again from an FTP server. Totally accurate. I missed the star. So what is this Sass thing? So Sass is a proprietary programming language and software package. It was developed the development began in the 60s, but consistent releases started in the early 70s. It was only recently has a free or non-commercial version been released, but to universities so they can start using it. What is it? Well, Sass is a statistical programming language. So it's a language that makes it easy to do statistical statistical operations on big data sets. So other statistical languages are like R, SPSS, and MATLABs. So their whole design is to make it really easy to run an operation on a big data set and to sort of filter and do statistical stuff. It has functions and routines that will operate on the entire data set. And then the results are usually sort of aggregates or summaries or statistical operations. So what's the problem with RTRA? So first is the programs need to be written in Sass. RTRA on top of that only runs a small subset of Sass because not all Sass functions would be safe to let users execute because we want to sort of mitigate issues and and control the results. You need the RTRA dataset documentation to know the names of all the datasets and variables that you're going to be using in your Sass program. You need the survey documentation, because that's all the metadata, but what those variables actually mean and how they map to questions that were asked on the surveys. So it's important to also have that documentation. And then you need the RTRA parameters documentation. Some of those variables are controlled, and so they're removed from the data sets, and there's other changes or precision things made for data cleanup. So to write this Sass program, not only do you have to know Sass, but you need a lot of stuff.
Are you providing data dictionaries to people?
You need to get provided a lot of things. So they do that. This is a program that's in place.
This data is not open. I guess not open data.
No, this is not open data. So
No.
this is a whole service, because the data you're operating on, like, you don't get the data, because the data is essentially all the data that sort of can't be released because of privacy issues.
Yeah.
But this is just a way to provide access to it.
Yeah, this is a service where you have to pay to have access to it. Say if you're in a university, for example, and you will get data back, but it will be filtered, so you can't just see the raw data. Right?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and that's the system that exists in place. So what's the solution to sort of mitigate all those problems with this system? So the client wanted a GUI that would allow people who didn't know Sass to write Sass programs. The software would be flexible enough for them to write useful Sass programs with it. And also, if it showed them how their ideas were expressed in Sass and sort of taught them a little bit on how to write Sass, they would, and sort of help them not need all these other documents to sort of write their RTRA programs, that would be really nice too. So this is what the client wants. So they'd asked this a few times and had been told this is basically going to be impossible. So one of the problems is GUI programming languages are generally extremely limited, extremely difficult to actually write useful programs with, or terrible, and potentially any combination of those. There are existing GUIs for Sass programming already, but all of them were sort of too limited or way too complex to expose to the target audience, and they still don't meet any of the documentation, fix any of the documentation problems that this system has. So,
So I was joking the other day that I realized building this that the first step in doing something that seemed impossible in our case was to having great clients, because there's some clients that are really tricky to work with, others are good. We were lucky in that particular project to have clients that were very open, and they came, instead of come to us with we want you to do this way with this tool, they came, we have a problem. We'd like to do this kind of stuff. Can you figure something out for us? So they were more open in listening to possible solutions. So we did a lot of iteration with them, and every time we were showing something new, they were always happy with it. So if possible, if you can choose your client, choose a great client.
So what our application needs. We needed a programming GUI that we designed. It had to be very responsive and fast, because it was going to be on the web, so that meant it needed to be a client-side application, so JavaScript. We're dealing with tons of documentation and metadata, so we needed a really good content management system to store all this. We have tens of thousands of different variables when you count all the data sets we have, and we don't even have all the data sets imported. So actually, shoot, there's not tens anymore. I think they're up to like 100,000 different nodes in the system. But there's tons and tons of content that needed to be there, so we need a really good CMS. We needed to be able to check the program variables against the metadata in the CMS. So we need to be able to load these variables and load sort of other metadata about them. We needed to generate valid Sass from whatever the user had generated in the GUI. And because this is going to be public, website from the Government of Canada, it needs to be accessible and responsive. So you need to be able to program Sass on your phone from a screen reader. Important. So here's the architecture from it. The architecture of the application. So we have the programs that people are going to write, variables, data sets, and then our custom Sass compiler. And then we have a reactive front end, which was the programming GUI written in VueJS, attached via Drupal.
Okay, so VueJS. Why we use this technology? I look at different possible technology. The main concern was we needed to find something that was very reactive, because having Drupal render it and every click having the page refresh was not doable for this. Even using some kind of Drupal Ajax-y stuff was kind of tricky. I wanted full control over the interface to be very reactive. So we use VueJS because it's very easy to program a really dynamic interface with it. It has a very reactive model, so we change some variables, some data, and then the whole interface morphs itself. We needed that. So that's basically why we use VueJS. It was especially approachable as a new technology, because before using it, it's my first time using it. So I had to learn VueJS while doing this application. And it was a good combination VueJS and Drupal.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is VueJS also has a data state that it tracks. And one of the things we need to do is load and save programs that they made in the front end in the back end. And then sort of reload them in the editor. And VueJS actually is a really great framework for doing that. All right, so step one, learn Sass. So this is something I had to do. I had to learn how this language works so I could write a compiler for it whose destination was Sass. That was a lot of fun. Sass has a lot of idiosyncrasies and a lot of magic. It really only has two different variable types that are totally incompatible. It has strings and it has numbers. Like I said, there's a lot of magic in Sass. Things will just implicitly happen. The idea is that it just it knows you're processing a data set, so it'll just do stuff. And then the language, unlike PHP, which is determined to use a different symbol for every single operation, Sass loves to use the colon. It does like 10 different things depending on the context, and gets very, very different in terms of what it does, because it can be used as an operator or can like prepend variables. It can do all kinds of things. It behaves completely differently wherever you put it. So that's lots of fun. The basic structure of it is straightforward, but the actual specifics are kind of tricky. Oh,
yeah, so we had this problem with, or thing we have to wrestle with, is that we cannot create a purely GUI programming interface. We could not recreate Sass in the GUI, right? So we had to limit the scope. So only basically the basic statistics programming routine will be supported. Only things that are very specific to RTRA, not the whole Sass language. The number one thing that we keep coming back to is that our competition is a text editor. If it takes you way more time to click 20 buttons to do something you could type in like 2 seconds, we're not doing it, right? So that's the main thing that was driving our UX was, is it too slow or too cumbersome to do? And we also needed to be bound to the Sass limitations.
Okay. Oh, sorry. That should say we shouldn't need to be bound to. That was part of our UX. Yes.
Yeah.
Our UX is Sass has a lot of limitations. We don't want to. We didn't want to force the user to learn how like Sass was generated and what you could and couldn't do in Sass to be able to use it, like Sass variable names and data structure names. have a lot of rules in terms of how you can name them. We don't want to just bubble up those rules so that you as a user had to do that. We're going to take care of all of that. So you type in whatever we want, and we will make valid Sass. That was sort of an important thing to do. So, this is so for designing the UI. We reviewed a whole bunch of Sass programs that were real Sass programs people had submitted. And what we tried to do is find sort of consistent goals for what the program authors were trying to do. Like what kind of things were different code sections doing? We weren't looking line by line because doing sort of a line by line GUI programming editor is just not going to work. It's too cumbersome to write a program in. We were trying to look at what were the common things people were doing with the code that they were writing. In the end, we extracted about 16 different patterns. There's sort of 16 really, really common things people did. And then we started designing components that would implement those patterns with these sort of the minimal set of data input. And then we further reduced those goals and patterns to a minimal set of UI components. So if we could sort of fold some of those patterns together, we're sort of doing that to sort of reduce the number of controls that we're offering the user, so that we didn't end up with an interface that kind of looks like JMeter, if you've ever used JMeter. You've used JMeter. Yeah, we didn't want JMeter. I love JMeter. So we did lots and lots of whiteboarding.
Yeah, so this is how we started. It's just a bunch of like scribbles on papers trying to figure out, okay, what kind of API, because this will be decoupled in a way. So what are the JSON endpoints we'll get to? What would the UX would look like? So we started with paper like this, and then we graduated to whiteboarding. We did a lot of that, a lot of iterations, and a lot of this was informed, okay, it needs to be easy, not too many clicks. It needs to be especially accessible. That's a big one. And we have to think about like the space that it takes, because the programs can be very long or very big. So yeah, there's a lot of iteration on the UI components. So this is kind of our design process, is that we would build something and we tweak it, we integrate it, we just make it better style-wise, and then we test it, and then cycle. And then basically you look at it, is it fun to use, right? I say, does it spark joy? If it doesn't, then we go back and loop again, try different components or different colors, or sometimes it's just different colors, different padding, different, does it look busy? Is it, simple? And often it was when it was a state where it's good, and then the last step is, yes, it has to be accessible. And sometimes, even though you have the most pretty thing, the better component you could think of, you're struggling with accessibility because it would work in just one screen reader, for example, not the other ones.
Have to pour one out for slide toggles.
Yes, I have the really good slider that I could change. The problem is that the text was changing depending on the toggle, and it was really complicated to make accessible in an understandable way.
Yeah.
So we
toggles.
changed the component entirely. So yes, it was pretty.
So let's take a look at the software that we ended up with. Oh, it's going to be in the web, isn't it? All right. All right, so it's already zoomed in. So really what you're looking at is almost all of it, is Drupal with a VueJS application over top of it. And the way that it actually interacts with Drupal is we built something that works like a super duper complicated CK editor plugin. Behind it is a text area, and this fills the text area in with JSON. And then this VueJS component is a Drupal 8 library that sort of our template adds in the markup it needs to attach to for this field to render. And then this whole VueJS loads the whole application and keeps it on top. And as it goes, it writes the JSON that generates into that text area. And so we can use Drupal standard form controls for submitting and saving it. because it's really just JSON in a text area when you take off all the JavaScript. But here, why don't you write a Sass program?
Okay, so first thing you do is you give this is a Drupal field, so you just say my. Okay, and then this part from here, this becomes a Vue app. So here, let's say, okay, I want to select a variable. A survey, sorry.
Data set.
Or a data set from a survey. So I'll pick this one.
Now that housing survey,
Yeah,
right?
it takes a while to load. There's a lot of data that's loading. By the way, this is a totally fake thing. It changed style. There you go. After 7 seconds, it just.
Did you pick? Oh, good. You picked one that has almost 2,000
Yes.
variables.
So this one, yeah, it says 1,700. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. So, and once you load a data set, you get this filter with a data table. So, go ahead. You can narrate it.
So the reason we put this here is because when you're dealing with variables that are available to you for writing your Sass program, all the variables in that data set are essentially, they're all the columns in that table you're working on, are sort of available. But when you're writing your program, you don't really want to have select boxes that have 2,000 things in them. So what we do right away is we make you select the ones that you want to talk about. And then these really are just control which ones are available when you're writing the rest of the program. And it gives you an interface to actually review the kind of data and variables that you want to deal with. Because most of the data in the data set you don't care about anyways. So just pick the data that you want to deal with and then build your Sass program based on that. And so that's what this component lets you do. I mean, we don't need a program that makes sense.
Okay, once you're done selecting your variables like this, you can click Initial Data Step, and then ask you to name it. So, my data set.
To teach you some statistical programming, what this is essentially doing is making sort of a subtable based on your data set. So you're gonna, the output of this is gonna be another table where you're gonna put processing on it, and then that output table is gonna be named my data set and run all your processing.
And once you create that data set, then you have a bunch of buttons to create certain operations on it. So for example, I want to do a calculation. So I can calculate. I'll create a variable, okay? Call it Joe. And I want to assign a value. And here I have multiple choice. I can assign a value to be this variable equals one of my variable that I selected. Or I could have a hard-coded value, like Joe equals 10, for example. But in this case, I can do Joe equal this. And here I have this little thingy here, just to reference what the variable is, the different possible value of that variable.
Yes.
I can show Sass now, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to show the Sass?
So once you've started creating a program like this, like you don't know what's going on, right? So if you go to the top here, I have either this button, Preview Sass Code, or I'll just put it in full screen mode. So we'll have side by side. So there you go. So this is the Sass code that the server generated. We have a compiler. Every time I do an operation here on the VueJS side, it will upload, like post to the server and say, here's my JSON, my configuration of my program. And then there's on the Drupal side, there's a compiler that will run through that and spit back out some Sass code.
So every time you do anything, your program gets compiled. And so you'll get, if you do certain things, you can get compiler errors and warnings and such to sort of hopefully guide you through writing your Sass code.
A good example here of things that we could really leverage in making this interface faster than typing is this one. A lot of the Sass, you saw this variable here, in that they have a value, which is a number, and they have a label. And a lot of the Sass program we saw were all, okay, if number is this, then take the label is this. If the number is that, label is that. So you could have a lot of if statement in your big program. So this one, ID to label, is a little quickie here. You just click this. You say, okay, I want Joe.
I think you're going to make a compiler.
Yes. I'll just create a new one here. Bob. Select a variable. It's based on this one. And there you go. Generate all this. If Geo equal this number, then my new variable Bob equal this.
What people were generally doing is most people's Sass programs are actually fairly simple. They'd sort of do some filtering, take an average of a weighted average, and then they'd want to be like, what's the average age of people who answered this, and then give me their location, and then the location is just a code, so they want to convert the code. And then, so this lets you just automatically.
Yeah, basically what you're getting once a user will send this, they will download this file and then upload it to the Statcan website, and it will go run to the system. What it'll get back is like a bunch of CSV files, for example, that it's just tables of data. Instead of having a huge table of data with numbers in it, you get these nice labels instead. So that's what this VueJS app does. So if I go a bit deeper, for example, I click statistics here, this will run a bunch of macros. This is a predefined macros that are specific to RTRA to calculate stats like a mean or a frequency of something or percentile. So if I select one, here's an error. I'm missing a bunch of things. So input, my data set, output name, I'll call Alice. So our name. Here, this one is a multi-select. I can have multiple. And this one doesn't need to make sense. There we go. And then if I scroll down here, you get at the bottom here the macro that fills in the correct information like work.mydataset and my variable and all this. That before this program, somebody would need to read a whole bunch of documentation, figuring out what the syntax is, where to put that stuff in their own program. So if you've done that before, if you're a Sass programmer, it's not a problem. But for most researchers, say at university, or student that arrives and wants to deal with some Statcan data, they have to learn Sass and they have to learn a whole bunch of documentation before. So this is the idea is simplifying this process.
All right, let's just go and talk more about stuff.
15 minutes.
Yep. So, like I said before, this is essentially a really fancy WYSIWYG editor in VueJS. So let's talk. Oh, sorry. As soon as you take a drink, it's going to throw it to you.
That's mine. Okay. Yeah, VueJS. So this was my first program, my first project using VueJS or using a real pure front-end application framework. Like I was mostly exclusively a Drupal developer for like 8 years. 7, I don't know. And I've used jQuery before. There's jQuery in Drupal. I've done the whole Drupal Ajax interface in a form, like a form area. And it didn't work for this project. So I was like, okay, and I was kind of burnt out a little bit of Drupal front-end teaming too. So I was like, okay, I want to try this new stuff. So I was like, okay, I researched which one I could use, like React, Vue, and others. And Vue seems to have a very easy on-ramp, a lot of documentation. So the first thing is learning. I've noticed that the best way to learn something new like this is to have something very challenging, like not doing a to-do app, but doing a very complex app that you have a lot of moving parts, forces you to learn something very deeply. So that's what it is. What I really realized about VueJS compared to my previous jQuery experience is in jQuery you basically you target the DOM, some classes, some IDs, and you change them. Vue is totally different. If you're trying to think this way in Vue, it won't work. You really need to think about the data approach. So you have a set of data or a configuration file, JSON or whatever format. You give VueJS some data, and it will manipulate it. So you just change that data, and the whole Vue app will change. So either you change it from the interface, from Vue itself, it changes the data, or you change the data, and then it changes the interface. So I really like this data-driven approach, and basically I discovered the joy of it was that the feedback loop was very, very fast compared to the Drupal front-end development, clearing a cache and then finding which field it is and which template file it is. In Vue, you have this concept of single file component where you have one file that you have your template, your HTML, then you have your script, and then you have your CSS. So you can have like, okay, I have a button. My button encapsulates everything, right? You don't have to go three different places to change something about your button. So I really like that. Key points. This app, it's JSON driven. So everything comes or goes out of it is JSON. It's first configured, like instead of hard coding things all over the place, I have like one JSON file that has everything in it, and then the first thing it does, it reads that file and then configures itself. And then it does a bunch of data store. There's something, I'll talk later about this, but there's something called VueX, which stores the data in business logic. It's dynamic and kind of very recursive, where you can have a component inside another component, and then that includes the parent. Like a component can include itself, basically. So that was useful for this because I needed to have very deeply nested programs. Yeah, another thing I've learned using VueJS is if you have make your input components as dumb as possible. Like I was trying to put too much logic in business logic in, say, a button or a drop down, and it was really tricky. So I abstracted the logic out of it. The drop down itself is very dumb. It says what it selected and then tell another process to actually do what you're supposed to do with it. Yeah, and that's basically it. Okay, basic interaction. As you can see on this diagram, that part is the Drupal Backend. What the Drupal Backend API does is that it has the Sass compiler, and it has the list, all the data. Like you use Drupal as a content management, basically, in this case. So you have content types of data sets, variables, and a safe program that we can implement later, and the compiler. And then once you render the page, because it's still a Drupal page, but you render it, and then the VueJS app loads, it will load that data dynamically from the Drupal site and put it into what it's called VueX. So a VueX store. It's like a centralized, like a singleton kind of concept, is that you have one store that contains all your data that Vue will interact with. And this is very interactive with the UI. You can see this arrow here. VueX store in UI is that you change something in the UI, you change it in the store, or vice versa. So that's kind of the process, is that you load the page, Vue load, Vue itself asks Drupal to download some information about what you selected, and once you select something, then it will post again to the server, ask for the compiler to change, and send it back to Vue. And all this is done in a text area. So basically, every time you change something, it basically saves the JSON in a text area and just says, post the text area back. So a closer view of the components, you have the VueX store I mentioned. Yes, it's like one monolithic thing, yeah. But it's divided in like little modules. In Vue, they call it modules in VueX. So I divided, like you can see, one is in charge of the config, one is the program that you write, another one is the list of, it deals with loading the list of surveys that you have, sample programs, and another one is just dealing with sending stuff to the compiler. And then you get UI components that are kind of categories. You have some that are just purely containers. Others are processes, like the calculate that you saw. Others are input elements, like a select box. And others are just utilitarian. And that's basically it. And then you got a bunch of plugins. A quick note on VueITNN here. The interface of VueITNN is very, very similar to Drupal. So as a T function, and just having two files that translates English or French is very, very similar. So from a Drupal background, it's really easy to understand.
Oh, so this talking more about this, the components are actually sort of can include themselves recursively. So you can embed sort of the same component inside each other. So when you have sort of the top, it has some controls, but you don't have to, when inside of it, you can also have another component that's using those controls. So you don't actually have to re-implement those things, and it works quite well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so I sort of talked about the Drupal design for this. This application is partially decoupled because you have this big front-end component, but it works very much like a CK editor or a WYSIWYG editor. Drupal is the CMS that backs it because we need so much data, and we need a compiler that can actually generate and provide like working Sass code that will work in this backend system. Because it'd be really bad if we gave you Sass code and then it broke when you tried to run it in RTRA. So the Drupal components, for the most part, are pretty standard. We just have a bunch of content types to store things like variables, surveys, data sets, and programs. The REST endpoints are all done with views. So they're just this view with a standard REST system, or views with the standard REST system. To bring in the content, we use migrations. Yeah, there's a lot more than 30,000 now. To migrate in all the different pieces of content, so standard migrate. And the real custom component is the Sass compiler, which we wrote it's a Drupal 8 service that does a bunch of things to compile what we got into Sass. So this is a fun project because I got to write a compiler. I was sort of wondering about whether or not we should actually write a full compiler for this, and it turned out what we were doing was compiling. So this was actually a really, really good approach. So even though what we get is a JSON object, so it's already structured, it still needs to turn into Sass, and we still need to do all kinds of compiler-like processes to it. So the first is lexical analysis of what we get. We have to break out the sources and grab all the data we want and remove any of the extraneous stuff and put things in the order we need to actually generate a program with. We need to do syntax checking because you can move components around and do invalid things in the UI. We need to that won't compile, so we need to check to make sure that everything is structured all right. We need to do type checking because Sass has types. And we do a whole bunch of different kinds of checks when we do type checking to make sure that your program will run. And then we do an intermediate generation. So we generate an intermediate data structure that is easier to template, so we have less templating errors to make sure that we can get it into the sort of destination language. So we make a sort of a simpler to template language out of the program that we sort of generate. And then finally, we do code generation, where we template out what we've compiled so far into actual Sass code. And so writing a compiler inside of PHP sort of seems like a crazy thing to do, except for as Drupal developers, we use PHP-based compilers all the time. That's how Twig works. Twig actually is compiled into PHP code and then cached and then executed every time you generate a template. And inside of Twig works the exact same way. It parses out your Twig file, removes extraneous stuff, syntax checks it, types checks to make sure everything will work, generates some intermediate code, and then templates that into PHP code. Nope, that's not the right keyboard. So that's it for our app. Are there any questions?
Did you run into any integration issues between VueJS, Drupal, and Sass?
So integration issues. So yes and no. Things went shockingly smoothly. And that's because there was a lot of planning that went into before we integrated. So I wrote the compiler and the Drupal parts, and Phil wrote the UI. But we really designed the UI together and how that data was going to work. And so we worked really closely together. And so things shockingly worked. Sort of almost the first time they were integrated.
We kind of designed the vocabulary of how to communicate. Like it's like basically a structure of a JSON, and having variables are named this way, and then you'll look over there for this other thing, and it was having the structure well documented or well talked to before. It helped a lot. So like one day we just made it together and it worked. So I'm like, what?
Yeah,
it was good.
And then sort of when the other integration point of generating Sass, luckily we had a lot of documentation on Sass because it's a language. I mean, I did have to learn it to write the compiler for it, but that went fairly smoothly too, and it was mostly because we started by just making a UI that would do really, really simple things, and then sort of making them more and more complicated. And it did generate a few syntax errors now and again, but it was a matter of testing and solving those. And because we went with sort of a real compiler design with the intermediate code, it made it so that when we did generate syntax errors, it was really easy to fix them, because it would be one section of the template that was generating the syntax errors, and it wasn't all the components didn't template themselves. They sort of templated down into only a few things that would get templated into Sass code. And so you could actually fix them really quickly. So yeah, shockingly, there were very few integration issues. I think the bigger issues from this project came from trying to make all the thing accessible in the end. And the design. There was a lot of time in design.
Yeah. One little thing, for example, I use VueCLI to generate my project, and it's a tool for Vue to help run things. By default, it outputs files with a random string beside it. You call it a cache busting thing. Is that whenever you build it again, it's never the same file, so you're sure that the browser will load a new file. But for purposes, it needs to be bundled into the Drupal library. So I needed to disable that so that the files are always the same, and Drupal handles loading that file.
Yeah, and putting its own cache busting on it. So, yeah.
So have you open sourced this yet, or is it still pretty specific to your?
It's very specific.
Yeah.
I'd love to open source components of it, except for like.
Is there anything really specific in the compiler?
Yeah, like I don't think anyone's going to need a compiler that compiles custom JSON structures into like a very specific subset of Sass. Like if anyone needed that, I'd be shocked, because like there's not really a lot in there that isn't really hyper specific, and the stuff that isn't and is generic is like really just sort of generic Drupal stuff.
Or generic VueJS stuff. That,
yeah.
I'm not making components that, like, I'm reusing third-party components, and and my custom components are very too specific to this use case. So it will take a few minutes for you to build another component that does something similar but not the same, right? So it's not.
Yeah. I think our contributions for this is this in the form of this presentation, because the custom stuff and the design are sort of more the shareable things. Hey.
For that, actually, there's more than just Statcan that it need to deal with that kind of problem of data sets that they need to anonymize down.
Yeah.
So sharing that out.
So that part is not something that we have in this project.
But it's still an area that, like, it's the whole package is something that would be of value to other departments.
Yes. So, but the RTRA in that part of it is quite old. So I'm not sure you want that part of it.
Yeah.
This part, I'm saying there's still value.
There's still value.
Sharing it.
Sure. If
I
you
don't
have a
thi-
use case, I mean,
Yeah,
we'd
the
like
thing
to,
is
love
that
to
there's
talk to you.
nothing in there that is secret. So technically, it could be open source.
Yeah.
It's will somebody make sense of it or use of it? I don't know.
I
So,
will tell you probably yes.
Sure. Well, we'd love to. We'd love to
Yeah.
talk if you actually want it.
Mhm.
How long did the project take?
About a year. Now a year and a half because half the year is just going to accessibility testing. So we're almost there. We have like one issue left.
I mean, the
so-
fact
so-
they disappeared with the app for like 6 to 8 weeks didn't make things go any faster.
Yeah.
Uh,
Kieran over there in the red shirt has been doing a lot of accessibility stuff for us. So thank you.
when we delivered this to Statscan's accessibility team, they kind of panicked. They had never seen anything like this
Yeah.
to
Because
evaluate.
normally when you ask is like, okay, how many pages do you have to test? And
It's
okay,
like, it doesn't
one?
really. There's only one page. Yeah.
yeah, but it's a bit complex.
How
yeah.
many buttons are on it? As many as you want.
Yeah, there's no limit.
Do you look at any other open source platforms like Jupyter Notebooks or Shiny apps?
We looked at a lot of them.
Or the limitation that said thou shalt use Sass and nothing but Sass?
Oh, and well, this like we're integrating with an existing like service. So like what we had to output was the RTRA flavor of Sass.
Yeah.
Like that was the output of these things.
Same.
And it's designing a UI that will allow people who don't know about Sass, don't know about RTRA, and don't necessarily want to have all these documentation files open to be able to sort of leverage this other system. So, yeah, that was the goal was to output Sass and this particular flavor of Sass. So that's sort of the one bit of requirement that it wasn't going to change because that meant changing the whole backend.
Actually, this is not interfacing with any of the backend. Once you're done with using this app, you download the file,
Yeah.
and then you'll use the other system to upload it. There was things in the plans. I don't know if it will happen or not. We'll see in the future to overhaul their system, so to have one interface that does everything. But for now, it's separate. Right?
So one of the other complications too is there's a whole naming standard. So to make your programs actually work, they need to have a magic name, magic tokens in the file name. So one of the things this actually does handle that for you. So when you download it, it generates. Oh, you can't see that it can't see it as a file name. If you can read the file name, it put the tags in the format that you need to actually make this compile when you upload it. And the output of this is this downloaded file that you can modify it. So one of the other things you can do is just use this GUI as a starting point for your Sass programs. Any other questions? Well,
Thank you.
thank you very much.